Well, I'm sorry you have to listen to me again. So a couple of months ago, I sat down with the No-Till Partnership, and they asked me to work on some Dryland budget comparisons. And I guess last year you saw something a little bit similar. We started out with some budgets that were developed for 2011. These are now the 2013 budgets, so I think it's been a year since you've actually seen some Dryland budget comparisons. The second topic I'm going to discuss is something that's really hot right now, especially as an economist, and that's the value of water. So not only does what does water cost us, but what is its true and honest value. So I'm going to start out with the boring stuff and talk about Dryland budget comparisons. And once again, I use the 2013 Nebraska crop budgets, which are put together every year by Robert Klein and Roger Wilson. These two gentlemen take a lot of time to scout out prices and cultural practices and put together, I believe there were 53 separate crop budgets for the state of Nebraska. When they do that, sometimes western Nebraska kind of comes out on the other side. Our fertilizer prices might be a little bit different. Our cultural practices in terms of how we work our ground is a little bit different. So I actually edited these budgets from their original estimations and worked with several people to make sure that they were correct. So we saw this earlier, but I'm going to show you a couple different things on the budget systems. I pointed out the depreciation earlier. It's really one of those things, again, that doesn't come out of your pocket, but that does need to be considered in your cost per bushel. As we move down and look at the materials and services, I think it's really interesting. You'll see blue shaded boxes. I don't know why I'm popping. You'll see blue shaded boxes and yellow shaded boxes. Those blue boxes are drop-down menus where you can go in it and you can select specific line items. So I can select my fertilizer, I can select my herbicide, and it'll automatically calculate those prices for you. Just the same as in the top in the field operations, I can select what field operation I want to use. As we move down the screen, I'm going to walk over here. As we move down the screen, as I said before, these are kind of the things we forget about sometimes as producers. And I always get asked, so we have that total listed cost for field operations, materials, and services, and that's just the addition of the top two main boxes. Then that next line that's indented in is the interest on options capital, and nobody ever knows where this number comes from. So what it is it's the addition of your non-depreciation field operation costs and your materials and services. Then what they do is they add those together and multiply it. This year it's by 5% for 6 months. So what they're saying there is that if you were not farming and you had not purchased those materials or you had not drug your equipment through the field, that money would still be sitting in the bank. And we have to account for the fact that that money is not accruing interest. So that's a cost to us as a producer. So for this particular situation, that's $5.55 we missed out on, just because that money wasn't sitting in the bank. Then we go through and we estimate overhead at $20 an acre. Real estate opportunity cost, if we weren't farming that land, what could we be doing with it? Then we have to pay for some taxes, and then we come out with the total cost. As you look down at the very bottom, there's a cost per bushel and there's a cash cost per bushel. I highly encourage you to use the cost per bushel, not the cash cost per bushel. Again, that cost per bushel includes depreciation, taxes, land values, etc. That cash cost per bushel is what comes out of your pocket. It's more of what your banker's going to ask you about. Okay? But if you're just paying back the banker at the end of the day, you're not fully capturing the value of that commodity or that operation. So I started out with the old budgets that we had, and I sat down with Mark Watson a couple months ago, and we started to review them, and we added a P budget. And then I, again, took the budgets to my specialists, Gary Hergert, Bob Wilson, and then Gene Kazire and Jim Shield, and had them review whatever their specialty was or whatever they could help me out the most with. And so, again, this is not an economist's perspective in terms of the field operations. It comes from these gentlemen listed on the screen. So if you saw our budget presentation a couple years ago, a lot of things have changed. So I'm going to briefly go over some of the factors that are influencing the current budget. Overall, from 2012 to 2013, I can tell you that most fertilizer prices have decreased, I believe, with the exception of anhydrous ammonia. Seed prices have increased or are the same, and so are herbicides and fungicides. We see that real estate prices have increased. We're going to take some time to talk about that here in a minute. And we see that crop insurance premiums have increased. Now, something that is a reporting difference on our part is we changed one of our variables from, they called it electrical connect fees to electricity fixed. And that changed from like a $2 charge per acre to like a $30 charge per acre. And that's just a difference in reporting. It might not actually be a difference in reality of what you're paying to maintain your electricity on your pumps. So this is we're just gonna start in talking about land values. So what you see here, this is for the Panhandle, and you'll see that black dashed line is the center pivot irrigated cropland value, and it kind of goes like this. Okay, and we'll talk about some reasons why here in a minute. But those two bottom lines, the top gray line is dryland cropland with irrigation potential, and the bottom red line is dryland cropland with no irrigation potential. And I think what's interesting is, one, they're not increasing nearly as quickly as our center pivot irrigated friend, but also, two, that they're converging with one another. Saying that here in the Panhandle, whether you've got irrigation potential or not, the land values are coming together. Now, I could speculate and say that part of that is because it's much harder to drill a well these days, but it's an interesting point that we see in the land values. So if we look at total land values across the state, I caution us to look at the dryland cropland because we have to consider that that's accounting for all those guys on the east who consider themselves dryland. But I think what's really interesting is looking at this all land 5-year change in land value, 112%. Crop land values in the past 5 years have doubled. Let me repeat that. Crop land values in the past 5 years has doubled. And there's a lot of reasons that feed into this, and we'll talk about them in a second. So let's look actually at dry land. In the northwest is the Panhandle. And so our cropland, our dry land here, went to $660 per acre without irrigation potential, and to $680 with irrigation potential. You'll also notice that the change here is one of the highest changes on the board, with the exception of this irrigation practice here. So our dry land, cropland, even though it doesn't necessarily have the same shape as those other curves, more recently has been increasing at a faster rate. So your land is becoming more valuable for a dryland producer. So what is driving land values? And number one is the availability of money. Farming right now is profitable. Producers have a lot of money and they need to get rid of it. Okay? And so what they're doing is that they're taking that cash out of their pocket and they're reinvesting it in their operations, and a lot of times they're reinvesting it in land. Now, there's also low interest rates. It's cheap for us to borrow money if we don't have it in our pocket. So say we take a bunch of our money, put it in land, and finance the rest of it. Okay? There's also a lack of land for sale. Okay? I think the generational turnover is, I think it's once in every 75 years or something like that for the Panhandle at this point, that a piece of land will sell once in every 75 years. So there's not a lot of land for sale, and when it does go for sale, it's going for a good price. And finally, that the returns on land are still favorable. If I could stick my money in the bank or I can buy land, at the end of the day, what has the best return on investment? Currently, it's land. land usually is a better investment than other forms of financial investment. So that's driving land prices. I'm going to talk briefly about insurance rates. If you've looked at the 2013 crop budgets published by Roger Wilson, you'll notice that my crop insurance rates are different from his, because I went to areas here in the Panhandle and quoted price from RMA about insurance premiums for Panhandle producers. So what I did was I looked and found the county with the highest production in dryland for each given commodity and quoted for that. Your quotes might be different, and that's perfectly fine, but just so you know where those numbers come from, RMA does have a premium estimator. So let's get into the fun stuff. Alright, so I'm not going to show you a full-length sheet. I've got them at the end of the slides if you really are just dying to see them. But I'm just going to show you a brief summary of each of them, and then if you have questions, we can pull up those full sheets. So you saw the dryland corn budget, and we came out down here at a cost per bushel of $4.86. If we move over to the wheat no-till fallow, we estimated a yield at 55 bushels per acre, field operations of $66, materials and services of $121, interest on capital and overhead of $57, for a total cost per acre of $224.43 and a cost per bushel of $4.44. We also did a clean till fallow, kind of the same deal, fairly comparable, but our cost per bushel, because of the decreased yield that we estimated, was $5.04. Mark asked me yesterday, well, why didn't you do a wheat budget in a crop rotation? Well, I'm not an agronomist, so I don't want to just wing that. But if you would like to see one of those, I'd be happy to sit down and develop a crop budget with you for that situation where you're not allowing that ground to fallow, you're putting it into a rotation. I would be happy to develop that for Western Nebraska. You can email me or give me a call, and we'll do that at some point. So if we move on, we looked at dryland peas, which are becoming a hot topic of discussion, especially in this area, because of the potential for a market. Our per unit or our per bushel price came out at $5.10. For the millet, we estimated a 2,200 weight yield for a cost per hundredweight of $8.57. And sunflowers, we came out at cost per hundredweight of $22.82. So these look really great in this way, but I think it's kind of hard to imagine what the profit will be when you look at them like that. So what I did was I kind of wanted to show you a revenue per acre. Now here's the thing about being an economist and showing you revenue per acre is we are never right on what the price will actually be. Okay, I will say it again. I will never be right at forecasting prices. Every economist's crystal ball is usually wrong. Okay, so in an effort to combat that, what I said was, well, let's look at what's happened historically, and we'll take a 3-year average price. So by doing that, we see that our millet, and if you looked at millet, the price is a lot higher than $9.52 right now. So if you've got millet in your bins, I think you know what you should be doing with it. So this is probably lowballing millet right now, but it actually comes out on our low end of revenue per acre. Now, the peas, we currently aren't reporting a pea price, so how do we estimate pea price? So I went to USDA NAS and I pulled up Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, and Washington and took the average for 3 years of those states. So that just shows you kind of some idea of profitability if you were to utilize these cost estimates and those income estimates. Are there any questions about the budgets before I move on? I know they're so exciting, you're just dying to ask a question. Like I said, I fully believe that those budgets are something that you have to develop yourself. what I produce is a ballpark estimate to hand to somebody who's considering maybe changing their operation or looking into a new commodity. But if you're already producing those commodities, you should be calculating those budgets on your own. And if you would like to utilize that tool, I would be happy to put those spreadsheets into your hands so that you can take them and modify them to reflect your system. Yes? Yes. It is not averaging in a 2-year average. Okay. Sorry, on the wheat, it is not averaging in a 2-year average. That's the year you harvest. Right. Per year, you're getting half. Okay. So now we're going to talk about something that has been a hot topic and I think is really interesting. And this time I'm not kidding about how interesting it is because we know what water costs us. We know how much it costs us to pump it out of the ground, to run our irrigation wells, etc. But really, the question is, what is that water worth? So I'm going to start out here, and there'll be more words this time, which is always good. But Bruce Johnson in Lincoln wrote an article for the Cornhusker Economics publication, and I think he probably defined value versus cost of water the best that I've heard in a while. He said, the cost of water as an input for production is the cost required to pump and distribute that water. The value of water can be attributed to the difference in irrigation revenue versus dryland revenue. So what we're saying is the value of water is the difference in your yield multiplied by the price that you'll get when subtracting out your costs. So how much money is that water giving you back is the value of that water. I think it's important that we know that the value is dependent on the commodity for which the irrigation is used. The more valuable the commodity or the greater the difference between irrigated and non-irrigated revenue, the more valuable the irrigation. And I think this is probably the hardest thing to think about, is that we have to consider water a commodity itself. So we know with our crops, as supply and demand changes, the price of that crop changes. Same thing with water. As the supply and demand of that water changes, so does the value of it. So I'm going to start in and talk about our calculations, and we have to consider water, again, in that supply-demand scenario. So what I wanted to do was look at 2012 as a year by itself and say, if I was calculating this last year at this time, and I didn't know that it would become Hades in western Nebraska, what would the value of water be? And so we're going to look at it in a without drought scenario, and we're going to look at it in a with drought scenario. And when we do that, I have to calculate it irrigated and non-irrigated under each of those situations. And then I also have to predict for each of those 4 scenarios a yield, a price, a production cost, and an irrigation need. So this simple question of what is the value of water becomes complicated quite quickly. So just to show you the math, the first part of it's fairly simple. Equations 1 and 2, I'm sorry, it doesn't show up nearly as well, but are basically the same thing. We're just going to calculate one for irrigated and the other for non-irrigated. And we're finding that revenue. So the first equation says that we're going to take irrigated yield, multiply it by a price to get our total cash receipts, subtract out our irrigated production costs to get an irrigated revenue. Do the same equation again except for the non-irrigated. And then once we've got the irrigated and non-irrigated revenue, we need to find out the dollar attributed to irrigation by subtracting the non-irrigated revenue from the irrigated revenue. Then the question becomes, so great, we have basically a dollar amount per acre. And I actually had a producer call the office yesterday and say, what's the dollar per inch of water? He was in a situation where he contracted out some water and the guy overspent it. How much does the guy who overspent owe the guy who contracted? It's a good question. So hopefully we can try to answer that. And the other thing is, how much is water in the Nebraska Panhandle in 2012 worth? Total, what is it worth? So, bear with me, the table looks kind of gross, but it's really simple. Oh, wait, I gotta backtrack. We'll start out with the discussion of quantifying drought. And I started thinking about this question and I said, well, drought is a lack of precipitation, I know that. But when you're an economist or when you start to think about these things, how do you really say what is drought? I have precipitation data, but then if you think about 2012, what made it so terrible is not only did we not have rain, but it was 1,000,000 degrees. So, if I did get any water, it evaporated immediately. So we had to consider drought in multiple dimensions, and I decided I really didn't know what I was doing when it came to drought quantifying. So I went to the U.S. Drought Monitor, and I let them do it for me. What I said was that for each year from 2000 to 2011, if the percentage of drought is greater than the annual average percentage of drought from 2000 to 2011 for both the United States and the state of Nebraska, we would consider that a drought year. Okay? So it had to be classified as a drought by the U.S. and by Nebraska. And you could do it differently if you wanted to, but that's how I did it. So that gave me drought years of 2002, 3, 4, and 6. So now I've got my drought years and I got my non-drought years. The question becomes, well, how the heck do I figure out what the yield was from a drought to a non-drought year? Well, we go to the wonderful USDA NASS. We pull up from 2000 to 2011. We find out what our yield was for our non-drought years and what our yield was for our drought years. And we find that out for irrigated and non-irrigated. And then we come to the question of price. I told you I don't like price forecasting. I don't have a crystal ball that's absolutely spot on. So what I said was that without drought, our price would have been the 3-year average. And with drought, I went to USDA NASS and just pulled their marketing year for 2012, what the price paid out was. So we multiply those numbers, that yield and that price for each scenario, we get a total cash receipts. I estimated a production cost for this commodity, this corn, estimated production cost based on the yield, and then we subtract those out and get a revenue. So without drought, our dollar per acre attributed to irrigation is $212, and our with drought is $425. Okay? Then yesterday the gentleman comes to me and says, well, what's the value per inch of water? The best thing that I could do was go to our research. Dean Yance did a Neb Guide publication a couple years ago that gives you the inches of water required per commodity. And then, so for corn it was 27.25. Then we subtracted out the average inches of rain for a drought and a non-drought year, calculated an irrigation needed to give us the total inches, dollars per inch of irrigation. So for corn, our value of water, ballpark, is somewhere between $13 and $22. Now the top part of this is exactly the same. And I wanted to look at the number of acres of corn in the Panhandle district. And what I said was that, and I'll go over this assumption again, was that the number of acres would not change from a drought to a non-drought year. Just for simplicity purposes of my calculation, this is the average number of acres of corn in the Panhandle from 2000 to 2011. Okay, and so that gives us this beautiful, gigantic number down here. Without drought, the value of corn irrigation is $14 million, or about $29 million. I did have to make some more assumptions, and I know that they're not 100% positive, so please know that I know this. But I assumed that without irrigation, the production of dry beans and sugar beets would not exist. Thus, the irrigation revenue would equal the dollar per acre attributed to irrigation. The reason I did that is because I thought, there's a lot of sugar beet producers out there. There's a lot of dry edible bean producers out there, and that's an important part of the Nebraska Panhandle. But when you go to USDA NASS and you ask for dryland sugar beets or non-irrigated sugar beets, they say that doesn't exist. So I had no acreage to go off of. I know there's been some research done about moving sugar beets, etc. And I said this before, that the total number of acres per commodity would not change. So to kind of sum up what we looked at, here is the dollar value per inch of irrigation for wheat, corn, sugar beets, and then the two dry edible bean classifications. I think it's really interesting. You'll notice, maybe I haven't highlighted, on sugar beets, that the value of water without drought is higher than the value of water with drought. Anybody want to take a stab at why? Okay. Sugar beet acres don't have the ability to adjust during drought, right? So they're decreasing their yield and they're planting no matter what, because there's a penalty if they don't plant those acres. And so the price is now the same because our acres aren't adjusting. And so we're getting less yield because of the drought at a relatively similar price. So that's why the sugar beets doesn't adjust. And the Great Northern beans, I would just say that there's not enough of a difference between the relationship in the price and the yield to flip-flop that. Does that make sense to everybody? Should? Nod your head, yes? Okay. So now let's look at the value to the Panhandle as a whole. And I think it's great that our two commodities that had the highest dollar value per inch are our lowest value in the Panhandle. So even though it's worth a lot of money, there's not a lot of acres. So we should really be concerned with wheat, that was one of our lowest value dollar per inch, and sugar beets, that was kind of there in the middle. So even though the value is really high, that doesn't mean we should necessarily be focusing on those commodities when drought comes around, because the total impact occurs in some of those larger acreage commodities. So I guess with that, I will take some questions. Yes?
We're pretty much at a point where there are no more irrigation. With your total acreage numbers, did you differentiate between acres that are currently under irrigation for like the commodities of wheat and corn versus the acres that are under dry?
No, I did not adjust them, and that's some things I want to work on in the future. I was actually, we went out to dinner last night, and I was discussing with some of the no-till partnership about the fact that that's some research that I would enjoy doing, is looking at how that decrease in irrigation availability would influence acreage. But once you start adjusting those, then it's just another moving part that you have to change throughout the analysis, which I would be happy to do, but I think you need to have a better feel on the model as a whole before I would start tinkering with that acreage number. But I do agree there should be an account for the acreage swing when we start talking about adjusting it.
If you subtract out the dryland acres of wheat and corn, the price of that change drastically.
And I 100% agree that if we did, the comment was if you took out those dryland acres, you'd see that last page change very drastically, and I do agree that it would. But for the as basic as I could keep it without, because I could question the whole thing and turn it on its ear and have absolutely every part move. I would love to develop an actual model that would estimate your price, estimate your acreage, estimate your water use based on the number of acres, irrigated and non-irrigated, it would utilize. Other questions?
Do you have all this information in the internet where we can find it?
If you email me, I would be happy to send it to you. At this point, it's not up on my website, but I would be happy to put it there for you. Yes? It'll be there too. But I can send you, if you want to make the calculations on your own, I can clean up my sheets and post them up there if you'd like them. Any other questions? Well, thank you. Oh, we got one more, Mark.
I was just wondering, is there a site somewhere that a farmer can get on and plug in his own numbers to develop his personal budget?
Yeah. If you go to, I believe it's, I don't have it on there, of course. I believe it's agecon.unl.edu/crop budgets. Should have it on there. The other way you can get to that is cropwatch.unl.edu. Either one of those websites should connect you to those budgets. And what I would say is, as you go through those budgets, is to develop your own. There's a tab that says Master, and you can take it. It's completely blank, and you can mess it up all you want, and it'll work for you. Yes, it will pull out field operations for you. So let me just go to it. So it'll have those blue tabs, these blue sections. Sorry if you're colorblind, but the darker sections are drop-down menus that allow you to select every operation in the system. If you want to add an operation to the system, I can help you do that. There's some things that are under funky names or just simply aren't in it. Example, I had to add a plow to the system to be able to do the comparison on the previous analysis.
Did you say add
.unl.edu, yeah. Cropwatch.unl.edu. Sorry that I didn't put those on a slide. I should have. Any other questions or comments? Emotional outbursts. Well, thank you guys for being... Oh, got another one.
You said that you gave a reason for cropland increasing in value. Dryland cropland, though, increasing in value for those same reasons. These do not quite match in.
I would say because that there is such a limited amount of land available, those producers are still going and buying whatever they can. So I would say that money is still a factor. As far as interest, loans, same factor. I would say the reason the values of irrigated land are so much higher is because the differences in yield that they can obtain. But I would say the trend line drivers are the same. All right. Well, thank you guys so very much.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was very eye-opening.